All right, good morning, everybody. Yes, Kelly let the cat out of the bag. Mephibosheth is our person in our story today. Not an easy name to say, so let's just go ahead and get that out of the way. If I mess it up a bunch of times, I purposely wrote it a bunch of times. My decision today was, do I just say it once and then just ignore the name and call him something else for the rest of the time? Or do I just keep saying it over and over and over again until I figure out how to actually say it? So you're going to hear it a bunch of times. I'm probably going to mess it up once or twice. It's okay, right? Well, if you guys remember, so last week, Greg talked a little bit about David and how even before he was king, he was in battle after battle after battle, and many of these battles being with the Philistines over who they thought should inhabit and rule over the land that was promised to Israel. And I know, let's just get something out of the way here real quick this morning. I know that sometimes in our culture today, these parts of the Bible can be criticized as being just kind of barbaric stories about killing and about expanding kingdoms and death and destruction. And since we are now rightfully more sensitive to the hurt that these kinds of things can cause, many people can often be left feeling like, and maybe you're in that position here this morning, many times we can be left feeling like, you know what, the people in the Bible, the people that follow God, they're not really any different from the rest of the people in history and really even some of the terrible people that we see in our world today. Well, first of all, we need to understand something about Scripture, about the Bible. Let's understand one thing about it. And that is, in particular, these Old Testament stories and characters that we've been covering in this series. Much of the Bible as a whole, but certainly much of the Old Testament, is a record of actual people who lived and actual events that took place. Not all of them are prescriptive for how we ought to live, right? I mean, a few weeks ago, if you guys were here or if you heard, I talked about Nebuchadnezzar. And his life is mostly a lesson in what not to do, right? Not a life that we should pattern our lives after. But his story is a story of an actual person who lived. And it is a story that helps us to understand what people have gone through in order to follow God. Now, the second thing is, while that is absolutely true, there certainly are Bible characters who have done really great things. There are Bible characters who have done awful things. And really, mostly, there are Bible characters who have done some really great things and some bad things. And while that is definitely and totally true, there is lots and lots of evidence that the people who followed God were very much different from the people who didn't. And the reason that that is true, the reason that that is the case, is because Scripture shows us that these characters and these people are not the main character of the story. God is the author of human history, and God is the main character of each one of those stories, and each one of our stories, and every story that has ever been told. So today we're going to look at a story that highlights one way in which the people and the leaders that followed God were often very different from those that didn't. We see that on display in the life of a man named Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth's life lines up in the timeline very closely with David's. He would have been born just a little while before David would eventually become king. And so in order to tell his part of the story, we need, I think, a little bit of historical context. So if we go back to just a little while before David, if you may know this, the nation of Israel is being ruled by judges, and let's be honest, it's not going very well. It really is not going all that well. They have enemies all around them, and they want a king. One of the reasons, I'm sure there were other reasons, but one of the reasons that they wanted a king is because they wanted somebody who could command and lead, who could build up an army to help keep them safe from their enemies. So they anoint Saul to be that king, their first king. And Saul, he starts out okay, he starts out pretty good. And as he's building up his army, there is a group of people known as the Philistines that are constantly giving them all kinds of trouble, right? At one point, Goliath, who was a warrior, he was one of their military champions. He's out there taunting the Israelite army, and they want no part of fighting with him. They don't want anything to do with him. I mean, he was a giant. The scripture talks about him that way. But I mean, let's be honest, he had to be, right? He is described as having been wearing close to 150 pounds of armor. Not to mention the giant spear that Greg talked about that he was carrying. I mean, like, this guy, he had to be a large man, a fit man, like, absolutely for sure, right? Now, as many of you probably already know, this is where David comes onto the scene, right? A young David, he steps up, he faces Goliath, and he defeats him. And after that, David becomes very close with Saul and his family. He gets close to their family. He was a musician, David was, and so he would play music that Saul really enjoyed. Saul liked having him around. And then during this time, David also became very, very good friends with Saul's son, Jonathan, right? They were very close. They were like brothers. They hung out together all the time. In fact, at one point, these two guys, they make a promise with each other that they would look out after each other's families in the event that maybe one of them would potentially die in war or something like that. And so David then continues to rise up the ranks in Saul's army. He becomes one of Saul's best military commanders. And as that begins to happen, some people begin to talk about David like he might just be even a little bit better of a leader than Saul was, right? I mean, Saul was known to be a really great commander and leader. They wrote songs about him. And now people are starting to say, I think David might even be better than Saul was. Well, Saul doesn't care for this very much. This makes Saul very angry, and he gets jealous of David. This causes him to want to get rid of David, so he plots to kill him. And the last few years of Saul's life are really tragically consumed by his desire and his attempts to try to kill David. In fact, Jonathan, Saul's son, Jonathan actually helps David to escape from his father at one point during all of this when it looks like he's getting very close to taking his life. And so all of this is happening, right? And Saul's fixation on David has another byproduct that comes from that. And that is it causes Saul to become distracted from leading the nation. And as a result of that, the Philistines, they see an opening to attack. And so they attack, and they manage to kill Saul and 3 of his sons, Jonathan being one of them. Now, before he died, Jonathan had a son. His son was Mephibosheth, who we're talking about today. Mephibosheth was probably, it says, about 5 years old when the Philistines attacked, and they killed Saul and Jonathan. And so, and something we have to kind of understand is back then, whenever a warring nation would come in and they would conquer and they would kill the king in an attempt to take over that nation, one of the first things that they would do is that they would look to take out the entire royal family. They would look for them and make sure that they did that. Siblings, uncles, sons, anyone that they thought could claim the throne in the absence of the king. In fact, this was a completely normal thing for a new king to do, even if their ascension to the throne wasn't particularly contentious. If they were from a different family, they would seek to get rid of any of the previous leaders' remaining family. This was just normal in the culture of the day. And so when Mephibosheth's caretaker finds out that Saul and Jonathan have been killed, she flees with Mephibosheth. And knowing that he would likely become a target to be eliminated. And so in the process of this happening, the story says that she drops him, something happens, and he suffers some type of an injury, and his legs become crippled as a result of this happening. So they hide out in another city, and Mephibosheth hides out in another city for years, most likely planning to just stay there. I mean, think about this, right? He has no idea what would wait for him if he ever tried to come back into the city and come back into the kingdom. And especially as a crippled man, he knows that making a claim on the throne would be very, very difficult. And he would be more likely, it would be much more likely that if anybody knew there was an error out there that could possibly take over the throne, they would just look to find him and have him killed. So during all of this time, right, David is eventually anointed as the king of Judah, first of all, because the nation of Israel is split at this time. And so David becomes the king of Judah while Saul's last remaining surviving son, he survives that Philistine invasion, and he is made the king of the rest of Israel. And so internally within the nation of Israel, there is a lot of fighting still going on, and Saul's son dies, and as a result, then David is made the king over the entire kingdom. And so once this happens, this is where we pick up our story in 2 Samuel chapter 9, right? So David has been made king over the entire nation. He brings together his people, and he asks them a question. In chapter 9, verse 1, it says, David asked, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul?" And immediately everybody in the room, I'm sure, is like, oh, great, here we go, right? We know exactly what he wants. He wants us to find anyone from the previous royal family and make sure that we kill them so that we make sure that they can't come and try to take his throne away from him. And again, right, don't forget, this was a completely normal practice. It is what everyone would have expected David to do. It wouldn't have been shocking even a little bit if he had said, I need you to go and find all of the people from the royal family, report back to me once they're all gone. That would have been completely normal. But let's see what David actually asks. It says, David asked, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now, this was shocking. That was what the statement left everybody surprised in the room. Show kindness to the members of the family that ruled before you? I mean, not to mention, right, a king that turned on you and tried to have you killed. That was the weird thing in this story. Not a leader coming in and saying, you know, I want to take out everybody who could potentially be a threat to my power. That was standard operating procedure. This was weird. This was strange. To them, this was extremely different. But see, David, he remembered the promise that he made to Jonathan. Now, Jonathan's dad had gone completely crazy. He tried to have David killed because he got jealous of him. But Jonathan was a great friend, even through all of that. And he wants to do this for Jonathan's sake. I mean, if you know this, David would later be described as being a man after God's own heart. Despite many faults, there were plenty. David had plenty of faults with him and in his character. But this is the heart that they're talking about right here, right? This is that part of his character that is being referred to when he's described as being a man after God's own heart. This type of kindness, humility. He wants to show kindness to Saul's family for Jonathan's sake, but there is also another reason as well. So David then, he calls in a man named Ziba, who was a servant to Saul in the previous regime. And he asks him, do you know of anybody who is still left in Saul's family? We pick that up in verse 3, 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 3. It says, the king asked, is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness? To whom I can show God's kindness. So yes, he is absolutely motivated by the promise that he made to his friend Jonathan, but he is doing this because of his relationship with God. He knew that was what made him different. God is who made him what he was, gave him the position that he had. It was God's kindness that he wanted to show. Because, again, in this kind of a situation, man's version of kindness, man's version of mercy would have been to just kill the royal family as opposed to, say, keep them and torture them, because that was also a common practice of the day. That is what any other person in his place would have done, and believe me, they had plenty of examples to draw from. This is what they had seen happen over and over again in the past. But his relationship with God separated him. It made him different, and he knew it. I mean, the reason that he felt the way he did about Jonathan, the reason that he cared at all to keep his promise to him. I mean, think about it. David's life is littered with people breaking their promises to him, right? Saul had broken some pretty significant promises to David before, and that was all before he decided, I don't like this guy, I'm going to try to have him killed. And despite what had been done to him, David was different. He wanted to keep his promise to Jonathan. And the reason that he felt that way was because he chased after God's heart. He didn't do it perfectly. He wasn't always great at it. But he wanted to do things the way that God wanted him to do them. And that was very, very different from the cultures around him. So all of that then is the backdrop for how Mephibosheth ends up here at this point in the story, right? Ziba tells David that Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth, is in fact still around. He's out there. And so they bring Mephibosheth into David, and he says that he's going to give to him all of the land that once belonged to Saul. He's going to return that back to Mephibosheth and his family. And he also tells him that he will always have a seat at David's table. He's going to bring him in, and he's going to make sure that he is cared for. He's going to make sure that he has everything that he needs. He's going to keep him safe, right? And so Mephibosheth then responds to this in another completely unusual way. Mephibosheth responds to this with humility and grace, not common for the day. 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 8, it says, Mephibosheth bowed down and said, "What is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me?" Yeah, that's what he actually said. Now, he's probably talking about, maybe a little bit about the perception that people have of his physical infirmity, but he also is reflecting on the fact that he really should be dead. Anyone else would have had him killed once they found out there was another potential heir just out there roaming around, just still out there, right? He recognized how unusual it was that David would treat him this way. And again, as I said already, this too, Mephibosheth's response to David is very, very different from how most people would have acted. Think about Mephibosheth's own family history. This is a starkly different attitude from the one his grandfather Saul had, especially towards the end of his life. But think about this, right? Try to put yourself in that room. Imagine being in the room when this conversation is happening. I try to think about this, right? David says that he wants to show kindness to him, but was that just a trick to get him here? Is he gonna kill him once we get him here? And even if he does actually extend kindness to him like he says that he's going to, what will Mephibosheth do? How will he respond? I bet he spits in his face and tells him, you know what? Forget it. I'm coming for the kingdom that should rightfully be mine. But see, none of that happens. The story would probably be a lot more interesting if that's what happened, but that's not what happened. David keeps his word, and Mephibosheth responds with humility, respect, and gratitude. And you know what? That is not always easy, is it? It's not. It's not always easy. The most common thing for someone in that situation would have been to just say, hey, you know what? You might as well just kill me now. Because I am not going to live as a disgraced member of a former previous regime. You better just kill me now, or I am coming for your kingdom, a kingdom that should be mine. Now, maybe that's hard to relate to. Maybe you don't relate to something like that. You know, it's like when someone offers to help you out or maybe to pay the check at lunch and your pride just won't let you accept it. You wrestle the check away from them, right? And it's like, hey, I don't need any help. I don't need your help. I can take care of myself. It's like when a coworker at work they ask you if they can do anything to help you out, and you just kind of instinctually feel like there's probably some ulterior motive. Why are they even asking me this? You don't need to help me. I can do my own work. I don't want anybody to think I can't do my own work. It's like when somebody offers you parenting or life advice and you get ticked off at them. I'm sure we don't do that. You know, what do they know? You know, who are they to give me advice? Do you think you're better than me? You're not better than me. And even if what you said was right, I'm certainly not going to do what you told me to do because my pride just won't allow me to admit that I don't have everything figured out and I do actually need some help. Have you ever been there? Look, you can be honest. In fact, I would tell you that kind of honesty can be contagious. It can help others around you to know that they can also be honest. And if we're being real, we've all felt it, haven't we? I mean, that twinge of pride and ego that says, I'm strong enough, I'm smart enough, I make enough, I can pay my own bills, I can do my own work, I can raise my own kids. I don't need any help from you. Thank you very much. I can reclaim my own kingdom. I don't need you to show me any kindness. I just need you to step out of my way. Mephibosheth absolutely could have done that. In fact, it would have been expected of him to do a completely normal thing. But in humility, he chose differently. Because pride focuses on who is right. Sometimes we get stuck there, right? But humility focuses on what is right. Mephibosheth focused on handling things the right way, not the way that people expected him to, not the way that an entitled ego would have told him to. And you know what? When I think of this kind of humility, I think of somebody like George Washington, right? George Washington is the first president of America after America separates from the British. And some have said that he was so wildly popular that he could have been president for as long as he wanted to be. And he was a relatively young guy. That would have been for a long time. He could have been president for a while, right? In 1796, nearing the end of his second term as president, Washington makes an address where he tells everybody that he is not going to seek a third term as president. And reportedly, I wasn't there, it was a while ago, so I don't know for sure, but reportedly there were some people that were maybe a little bit concerned that because of his popularity, Washington would just stay in power and become kind of like a king himself. But that's what they had just gotten away from. They didn't want to see that happen again. And that's not a concern, by the way, that these people just made up. Right? Oliver Cromwell did essentially that very thing after the English Civil War about 100 years before. But in humility, Washington graciously stepped aside. And that type of humility is contagious. It has an effect on people. Think about this, because a lot of times the dates just don't line up. I know a lot of these historical events, but the dates just don't match up, right? He does that in 1796, and despite there being no presidential term limit written into law until 1951, no president during that time ever went after a third term. That was the standard that was set. If he had been arrogant and let his ego get out of control, he could have set a very different standard. Truthfully, in fact, he could have just kept the standards that had been alive for political leaders through all the way since the beginning of the earliest civilizations. He showed a tremendous amount of humility to step aside, and it set a new standard, one that apparently people admired and wanted to emulate. You know, it's something that I hope is a part of who I am as a person as well. Now, I can't honestly say that I take a whole lot of inspiration from George Washington into my personal life. Don't think about him a whole lot. But I can think of several people throughout my life that have been so incredibly humble and gracious that has inspired me to want to be more like that. Some family members of mine, my Uncle John, my Uncle Mike. I mean, I can remember as a kid my Uncle Mike playing basketball with me, giving me pointers, talking baseball. I mean, as a kid, as a young kid, right? And this is a guy who wasn't just sitting around, he had nothing to do. This is a guy who was always busy. He was always working hard. He was running his own business. He was working a farm. He always had stuff going on. But he always had time to give us his attention. And when you talked to him, you never felt like he was distracted or like he was just trying to get you to finish and be quiet so that he could move on and go do something else that was way more important than you were. He was fully there. He never felt like he or his time were more important than you, even though you knew that he no doubt had plenty of other things that he could be doing. My Uncle Lee is an amazing man. He's taught me so much about ministry and about serving others and about caring for people. He's a retired pastor himself. And I know now, from having been in ministry myself, that there were always things weighing on his mind. There were always things to be thinking about, people to be concerned about. You know, problems to deal with, an event to prepare for, a sermon to get ready for, not to mention people that are hurting, that you're connected to, all of those things weighing on his mind. But you know what? When you were with him, you were the most important thing to him in that moment. He always took the time to talk with me. He always took the time to show me things, to answer questions that I had. I had questions for him. A lot of times I really just observed and watched the way he lived. And I've learned so much from him. And I know right now that I could just call him up completely out of nowhere, haven't talked to him in how long, and he would be all in. He would be completely there for the conversation. Not annoyed, not caught up in his own stuff, but humble enough to give of himself and of his time wherever he could. And not just because I'm, his nephew and he owes that to me somehow. This is the way he is with everybody. I had a cousin, Tim, who was a very intelligent guy, very important in his work, and he was always busy doing stuff, whether it was work-related or family-related or at their home. Like he never just sat around and did nothing. You ever know somebody like that? He's just always doing something. But he was one of the most humble and gracious people that I have ever known. Tim also was a very good golfer. He taught my brother and I how to play golf when we were just little kids. And, I think about how painful that probably was at the beginning for him. I mean, can you imagine, right? Like, it had to be painful. Let me describe how painful it was. He took us golfing one time when I was a kid. I was probably 10, 12, something like that. I wasn't very old, and I hadn't played very much golf. And he took me and my brother both golfing, and it was in Kentucky, I believe. And so we went to a course I'd never been to before. And I actually snapped the head off of a driver of a set of clubs that we rented from the course. And the head of the driver landed in the middle of a pond. It wasn't coming back. We were not getting it back. I mean, imagine, right? These aren't your kids. You're under no obligation to be out here with these people. But he took the time to go out there with us, and I mean, imagine having to explain to the club owner, yeah, you know the clubs that you let us borrow, and yeah, we lost one of them. Well, we got part of it still. We brought the handle back. It was still there. I can't imagine having to do that. But he did all of that, and he never flinched. He took the time to show us how to play the game. He took the time to show us how not to break the clubs when you hit the ball. All of those things, right? And I was absolutely mesmerized by his golf game. I don't know if you ever, when you were a little kid, if you ever saw somebody hit a golf ball when you were standing like right there watching it. But I'm telling you, like, he would hit a driver and it would be perfectly straight and it looked like it was going to disappear over the mountains. Like I was like, how is that even possible? How can a person hit a ball that far? But the older that I got, as I got older and older, I became more and more mesmerized by his life, by his attitude toward people, his kindness, his compassion, his humility. That's what made the greatest impact on me. Another person, when I first started out as a youth pastor about 10, 12 years ago, something like that, I met a guy named Rodney. He and his wife, they were youth leaders with us at the time, and both of them, I don't know how two people like this ended up together, but both of them were absolutely the epitome of humble and gracious. And again, like in our culture today, in case maybe you're wondering this, you might think that you have to be ruthless and aggressive and maybe a bit of a jerk in order to get to the top, right? I'm telling you that's absolutely not true. Rodney had a very important high-up position in his career, and he is extremely, extremely well respected by everybody who knows him. And I think he'd be okay with me sharing this, but well beyond the age that a person would normally consider signing up to work with kids, he was still there being a leader for students, and he and his wife, they were absolutely amazing. And they were the best kind of role models to those students. They cared for them. They always had time for them. It didn't matter what they had going on. They were always right there ready to help. But not just that. They have also been the best of friends to Renee and I. They never once looked down on us, even though we were young enough to be their kids. And they have kids that are my age. So they never once did that. Never once did they, try to push us out of the way and say, you know what, just let us take over. We know what we're doing. Just get out of the way. They never once did that. They supported us. They cared for us. They helped us to be better together as a team. And that's what I admire most about them. Now listen, I understand something in this whole conversation, right? And that is that humility is not always easy. And it doesn't come naturally to most people most of the time. But think about what you experience. I want you to think about what you experience when you come across somebody that's like that. You notice it almost right away, don't you? Like you meet somebody and they're truly, genuinely just a kind and humble, compassionate person. They don't think too highly of themselves. They don't think everybody around them owes them something. You notice it right away, almost immediately, and it's refreshing, right? You sometimes maybe even wonder, like, how can they do it? Like, how are they able to be like this all the time? For me, it inspires me to want to try to be more like that. And Mephibosheth responded to David with the kind of humility that we love to see in other people. The kind of humility that we ought to seek to make a primary trait in our own character. And we know something. We know without a doubt that this wasn't just a crippled man giving in to David because he was no real threat, right? We know this because later in David's reign, we talked about Absalom, right? David's son Absalom would rebel against him and try to take his kingdom. What better opportunity could a person like Mephibosheth have than that to say, you know what? David and his family, they can't be trusted to lead anymore. Maybe we should just forget about them. Maybe somebody else should take over. right? That would have been the perfect opportunity to do that. He could have easily asserted his claim on the throne right then, the rightful heir from the line of our very first king, King Saul. Instead, because the people know that Mephibosheth and David are fairly close, a plot was devised to try to drive a wedge between them while David was in hiding from Absalom. And see, when David left and fled the city, he actually had planned for Mephibosheth to go with him. And so when David returns to Jerusalem finally, he asks Mephibosheth, hey, why didn't you come with me? And this is the interaction that they have. 2 Samuel chapter 19, verse 26, it says, this is Mephibosheth. He said, my lord the king, since I your servant am lame, I said, I will have my donkey saddled and I will ride on it so I can go with the king. But Ziba, my servant, betrayed me, and he has slandered your servant to my lord the king. My lord the king is like an angel of God, so do whatever you wish. All my grandfather's descendants deserve nothing but death from my lord the king. But you gave your servant a place among those who eat at your table. So what right do I have to make any more appeals to the king? Again, pride focuses on who is right. Humility focuses on what is right. And I think our society needs a whole lot more of this. Our world could use a lot more humility. See, Mephibosheth, he didn't pursue his own will, his entitlement. He didn't treat people like they owed him something. He was humble. He was gracious. He did the right thing when he wouldn't have even had to do anything. All he had to do was look the other way, and he could have reaped the benefit of what was happening. But he focused on what was right, and what they were doing to David wasn't right. It takes humility to do that. And something we've said here before, you've heard us say it many times, right? Life is difficult. We get it, and we all want to get it right. Let me give you a secret. Your life will be better with more of this. Your life will absolutely be better with more humility. Now, something that is absolutely amazing about this whole story is this entire story is a picture of what Jesus would eventually do for his people. Right? David offered grace to Mephibosheth when he did nothing to deserve it, which was incredibly unusual for his time. And Mephibosheth simply accepted and received it with grace and gratitude. Today, we're going to take some time to remember the sacrifice that Jesus did eventually make for all of us. And we're going to reflect on what I hope is our overwhelming gratitude for his kindness and his mercy. In just a little bit, Jeff is going to come and he's going to lead us through the Lord's Supper. But before we do that, we're going to sing a song together, and we're going to sing a song that is meant to remind us that we all can be forgiven through Christ. We can be forgiven through Christ.